Welcome! This is Ornamentary. If you enjoy falling asleep to uncomfortable truths and historically certified weirdness, you're in the right place. Go ahead and subscribe. You'll need something to listen to when you can't stop thinking about coffins. You're lying down. That was your first mistake, because in the past, lying down for too long was suspicious, especially if you were quiet, or cold, or just unresponsive. Centuries ago, people weren't afraid of dying. They were afraid of being buried alive, which, hot take, feels worse. There were no heart monitors, no brain scans, no coroner with a clipboard, just a candle, a mirror, and a room full of people guessing. And if they guessed wrong, you woke up underground, in a box, sometimes with scratch marks on the inside of the lid. The fear wasn't rare. It was widespread, documented, studied, profitable. Because in the golden age of premature burial panic, everyone was one fainting spell away from a tragic headline. So what did they do? They invented things, weird things, like coffin bells and breathing tubes and safety windows that opened from the inside. We're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to talk about how people used to diagnose death, or more accurately, how they didn't. Centuries ago, being declared dead wasn't a science. It was a vibe. No scans, no EEGs, just a man with a candle and a very confident opinion. They'd hold a mirror to your lips, check for fog, sometimes. Other times, they just stared at you for a bit and shrugged. Cold skin? Probably dead. Not moving? Dead enough. Eyes half open? Creepy, but still dead. And if you were very quiet, and very still, and very unlucky, they buried you. Occasionally someone would notice something odd. A little warmth, a twitch, a tiny breath. But they didn't want to be rude, so they said nothing. Besides, if you were alive, you'd probably say something, right? Unless you couldn't, because you were paralyzed, or sick, or in a coma, or fun twist, faking your own death. There was no system, no checklist, just cultural guesswork with a splash of superstition. Which is how we get to the next part of this story. People who are accidentally buried alive. Eventually, someone lies down, all the way, still, pale, silent. The family grieves, the priest arrives, the box is nailed shut. Only they weren't dead. Not yet. This happened. A lot. In 1741, a woman in France died of cholera. She was buried by sundown. The next morning they heard muffled screams. When they opened the grave, her hands were bloody, her face frozen in terror. In 1838, the young man in South Carolina collapsed at work. The doctor declared him dead. 3 days later, they exhumed the coffin after reports of strange noises. He had torn his fingernails off trying to claw his way out. These weren't isolated incidents. They were public fears. People carried newspaper clippings about live burials the way we share urban legends. Except these were real. Sometimes they'd exhume a coffin and find it upside down, scratched from the inside. Sometimes the corpse wasn't where they left it. Sometimes there were teeth marks on the wrists, as if they tried to wake themselves up with pain. Which leads to an obvious question. If being declared dead was so unreliable, why didn't they just wait? The answer: because waiting is expensive and inconvenient, and also, frankly, a little creepy. Better to bury fast and hope for the best. You live in Victorian England. Death is not a moment. It's a lifestyle. Mourning isn't private or quiet. It's performative, prescribed, practiced. There are rules for how long you must grieve, what you must wear, and how you must behave. If you lose your husband, you're expected to mourn for 2 full years, in black of course, with veils so thick you risk bumping into furniture. Lose a cousin? 6 weeks should do. Shops sell mourning stationery, mourning jewellery, mourning dolls for dead children, with porcelain skin and human hair. Photographers offer portraits with the deceased. You pose next to a dead sibling, prop them up with a stand, and hold very still. The blurriest figure in the photo was the one who happened to be alive. And amid all this death-flavoured etiquette, a question starts to fester. What if the dead aren't? The air is thick with anxiety. Science is advancing, but not fast enough to be helpful. You've heard the stories. People waking up mid-funeral, graves being dug up because someone heard tapping, the wealthy install bells, and breathing pipes in their tombs. Just in case, others are buried with a key, a whistle, a vial of poison for the second death if the first didn't take. Doctors begin publishing treatises with titles like Premature Burial and How It May Be Prevented, not horror novels, medical manuals. You skim them at parties, and the more you read, the worse it gets. You start to hear noises in the cemetery. You imagine movement under the dirt, a rustling, a thump. You begin to wonder if death can be misdiagnosed the way a cough or a fever can. Maybe dead is more of a placeholder, a tentative label. So you plan accordingly. Some Victorians refuse to be buried for days. Others ask for post-mortem decapitation. One man requests that his heart be pierced with a silver spike, just to be safe. Another insists his coffin have a window, not to let light in, but to let doubt out. You don't trust death, not entirely, because in Victorian England, death is everywhere, but certainty, that's harder to find. In 19th century Germany, being dead was a diagnosis you couldn't always trust. The doctors weren't confident. The families were nervous. So someone came up with an idea that felt both practical and quietly horrifying. Waiting mortuary, called Leichenhäuser. These were buildings designed not for the living, but for the ambiguously dead. Inside, bodies were laid out on display, not for mourning, for monitoring. A bell was tied to each corpse by string, usually around the finger. The other end, suspended in the ceiling rafters. If someone moved, the bell rang. That was the system. These weren't crude setups. Some had attendants on duty 24/7. Medical students, caretakers, or just whoever was willing to sit among the recently maybe deceased and listen for sounds. Some mortuaries had heating. Others had tunnels, so watchers didn't have to share air with the bodies. The bell was the focus, but the real story was the silence around it. No documented case ever confirmed a bell ringing, but that wasn't the point. The whole thing was theatre, a slow, anxious performance of not wanting to bury someone too early. Eventually, the practice faded, not because the fear disappeared, but because it got cheaper. Safety coffins replaced the waiting halls. People opted for strings and bells underground. instead of expensive stone mausoleums, but for a brief, strange chapter in medical history, the dead were placed on hold, just in case they weren't done yet. At some point, fear needs a product, and in the 18th and 19th centuries, the fear of premature burial finally found one: the safety coffin. A solution designed not to comfort the dead, but the living, those quietly panicking about dying too quietly. The idea wasn't new. Variations of the concept had floated around for centuries, but it wasn't until the public began to see real cases, clawed coffins, overturned corpses, muffled sounds from fresh graves, that the market responded, not with sympathy, with hardware. The first wave of safety coffins was rudimentary. A string tied to the hand of the corpse, threaded through a small pipe or tube to the surface, and attached to a bell. If the person moved, even slightly, the bell would ring. Simple, elegant, comforting if you believed in string. Families began demanding them. Coffin makers obliged. Bell cords became a feature. Some models came with a small sign attached to the bell. In case of movement, ring immediately. Helpful advice, provided there was someone nearby to hear it, provided they believed it, provided they weren't too embarrassed to check. But bells were just the beginning. Soon, inventors added air pipes to prevent suffocation, glass panels to allow inspection, hinged lids that could be opened from the inside. Some even included small ladders, under the deeply optimistic assumption that a recently revived individual could climb several feet of packed earth with little more than panic and resolve. And because this was the Victorian era, a time allergic to simplicity, these coffins grew increasingly elaborate. Brass fittings, polished lavers, etched instructions. One model featured a speaking tube designed to deliver whispered requests to the cemetery groundskeeper. Another included a hand-cranked oxygen system powered by someone above ground. Helpful, provided they didn't forget you. At first, these devices were marketed as practical, scientific, evidence-based. Doctors supported them. Clergy approved. But soon, as the fear deepened, the sales pitch changed. Safety coffins weren't just functional, they were moral, a way to protect the soul, to prevent the horror of being buried with breath still in your lungs, a sin against both body and spirit. It worked. The wealthy commissioned elaborate models. Some paid to be buried in mausoleums with trapdoors. Others demanded their heart be pierced before burial, just in case. But for those without money and without influence, the safest coffin remained the cheapest. Delay. Wait 3 days. Watch for signs. Listen carefully, but waiting cost money. Plots had to be reused. Funerals had to proceed. Families needed closure, quickly, neatly, and preferably without revisits. So the coffin became a compromise, a kind of final insurance policy against the worst kind of clerical error. And for a while, the public believed in them. They believed in bells and levers and polite rescue tubes. They believed these contraptions would work, that someone would hear, that help would come, that death, if mistaken, would be reversible. It wasn't. But the belief mattered more than the function. Because the real function of a safety coffin wasn't escape, it was reassurance, a way to lie still beneath the soil and think, maybe someone will come back for me. You know what panic breeds? Paperwork, more specifically, patents. By the mid to late 1800s, the fear of being buried alive had become so widespread and so thoroughly commodified that inventors began flooding patent offices with blueprints for escape. These weren't fringe eccentrics, these were engineers, physicians, watchmakers, men in waistcoats with serious facial hair and access to filing fees. One of the earliest safety coffin patents was filed in 1829 by a German priest named Johann Tayberger. His design featured a series of strings attached to the corpse's arms, legs and head, all connected to a bell above ground. If the deceased moved even slightly, the bell would ring, and not just once. Tayberger included a mechanism to prevent false alarms from corpse twitching, because even your own potential revival needed bureaucratic moderation. Others were less cautious. Franz Vester patented a model that included not just a bell, but also a flag, a ventilation system, and just in case, a viewing window. The idea was to allow anyone passing by to peer in and confirm whether the occupant was still a corpse or simply a very tired German man. Another featured a speaking tube. This allowed the buried person to yell to the surface, or whisper, or cough politely. The assumption here is that someone would be standing near the grave, listening, for days, just in case. Some inventors dispensed with subtlety entirely. In 1885, one coffin design proposed a spring-loaded lid that would burst open with enough force to eject the undead occupant out of the grave entirely, a feature that would have made Victorian funerals significantly more exciting. Others leaned into the idea of pre-installed weapons. There are patents for coffins with built-in air tanks, light sources, levers, buzzers, even tiny periscopes. One concept involved a battery-powered alarm system that would send a telegraph to the cemetery office, assuming the operator was awake and literate and not busy burying someone else. The details vary, but the intent is always the same. Control. Control over fate, over fear, over the dreadful uncertainty of not knowing whether you're really truly gone, or just stuck in a horizontal timeout. And while some of these designs were built and sold, often for exorbitant fees, most were theoretical. They lived on paper, blueprints for peace of mind, never tested, rarely implemented, and largely forgotten, because the real product being sold wasn't a device, it was reassurance. These weren't inventions, really. They were apologies in advance, a way to tell the not quite dead, we did what we could. We filed the patent. Of course, some patents got creative. One design included a feeding tube, so the accidentally buried could receive broth through a pipe. Another had a hand-cranked air pump that required someone above ground to turn it periodically. An excellent job for a butler, assuming you didn't mind hourly cemetery visits. There's even a design that included a clock inside the coffin, so if you woke up, you'd at least know how long you'd been out, because nothing pairs better with claustrophobic dread than accurate timekeeping. And then, a pièce de résistance, a coffin designed to detect movement, emit a loud sound, trigger a surface-level alarm, and then raise the entire casket back to ground level using a series of pulleys and gears, a full resurrection, mechanically assisted, more elevator than grave. These were the dreams of desperate men, precise, over-engineered. Almost none of them worked. But that wasn't the point. They existed not to be effective, but to be available, to be patented and published and clicked into articles for worried readers to discuss over tea. Because nothing says peace of mind like knowing your final resting place comes with optional bell-ringing functionality and a pull-to-resurrect mechanism that might, if the stars align, wake someone in time to save you. Might. In 1896, a man named William Tebb decided he didn't trust death. Not the concept, the paperwork. He believed too many people were being buried alive. And to prove his point, he compiled 219 cases of premature burial, alleged cases, mostly, hearsay, panic. But Tebb didn't care. He believed in quantity over certainty. 42 of those cases, he claimed, involved people being accidentally embalmed. So he founded a group, the Society for the Prevention of Premature Burial. That was the name. No ambiguity, no branding, just a mission statement with stationery. They advocated for new standards in death certification, longer waiting periods, more thorough examinations, and of course safety coffins. Lots of them. Some members even insisted on being buried with a small bell, a flask of water, and a revolver, just in case, for emergencies. Tebb wasn't alone. The society attracted doctors, clergy, civil servants, and more than a few amateur tapophobes. People who weren't scared of dying, just of waking up mid-funeral. They lobbied for changes to burial law. They published pamphlets. They gave public lectures with diagrams. Some of those diagrams included illustrations of ideal safety coffin layouts, complete with air vents, light sources, and feeding tubes. It didn't catch on, not officially. The medical establishment politely ignored them. The funeral industry wasn't thrilled either. Premature burial was bad for business, but safety coffins, worse. They introduced the possibility of error, and no one wanted to think about that. But the society kept going. They expanded to America. They printed testimonials. One man claimed he had been buried 4 times. Another insisted he'd been revived in the morgue by a careless janitor. The stories were inconsistent. The fear wasn't. Eventually, the society faded, not because their concerns were resolved, but because culture moved on. Death became institutional, certified, sanitized. The fear of being buried alive was replaced by the fear of dying in a hospital with no one listening. Safer, maybe, but not more comforting. Today, the society exists mostly in footnotes, a historical curiosity, a reminder that in the absence of certainty, people will build systems, not because they're likely to work, but because it feels better than silence. The bell was just the beginning. Once people accepted that premature burial was a real possibility, or at least a terrifying one, the creativity began, and it got strange quickly. Bells tied to fingers were simple, elegant, but not everyone trusted string. Some wanted upgrade. That's when the tubes appeared. Speaking tubes, mostly. Long metal pipes that ran from coffin to surface. Not for breathing, for talking. In case you woke up underground and had something urgent to say, like "I was not done being alive," or "this is wildly inconvenient." The idea was that someone above could lean in and hear your panic. Some designs even included ear trumpets, like graveyard intercoms, but with more soil. Then came the periscopes. Yes, actual periscopes. Small glass cylinders installed in the coffin lid, poking through the earth above. If you opened your eyes, you could look up and see sky. Sometimes, more often, you'd see a metal cap. But it was enough. Engineers filed patents for coffin windows, trapdoors, and even telescoping mirrors. One inventor designed a system where you could raise a tiny flag by shifting your body weight. Another thought it would be helpful if the buried person could trigger fireworks. That one didn't catch on. Sky. There was even a coffin built with a ladder. The ad promised you could climb out, assuming you had the strength, coordination, and ability to push aside several feet of compacted dirt. It was optimistic, but not as optimistic as the coffin fitted with a compressed air horn. That one assumed the buried person would both stay calm and have a good sense of aim. History does not record any successful escapes. These inventions weren't common, but they weren't jokes either. People paid real money. They signed contracts. Some even toured the prototypes, like car buyers, inspecting new models. Safety coffins became a niche industry, serving not the dead, but the deeply anxious living. Eventually they fell out of fashion. Medicine got better, death got clearer, but the blueprints still exist. A whole archive of human ingenuity aimed at one quiet fear: waking up where you weren't supposed to. It turns out, escaping the grave wasn't cheap. Safety coffins, for all their bells and tubes and moral reassurance, were not made for the masses. They were status symbols, statements, the kind of purchase you made, not just to protect yourself, but to announce publicly that you could afford to be protected. The average working-class burial in the 1800s was a rushed, utilitarian affair. A wooden box, a patch of dirt, maybe a few words if someone remembered. There was no budget for ladders, or levers, or oxygen lines. Most people were buried quickly, quietly, and permanently. But the wealthy, they had options. They could browse catalogues. They could commission custom fittings. They could request features, include a flag, add a ventilation pipe, make sure there's room for a bell pull and a crossbar, just in case I wake up swinging. Some even hired professional watchers. People paid to sit by the grave for several days after the funeral, just in case something moved. This wasn't cheap, but it wasn't uncommon. It became part of the package. Wake, burial, watchman. If you couldn't afford that, you had to rely on improvisation. A cousin who agreed to linger, a neighbour who promised to keep an ear out, a child told to tap the grave with a stick every few hours. None of these were reliable. All of them were cheaper than a patented mechanism. cemeteries began offering safety packages. For an extra fee, they'd install your bell or speaking tube or emergency lever, though how often these were maintained is unclear. In some places, the fee covered little more than the illusion of preparedness. A plaque, a pipe, a nod to your fear. There were class layers even in death, especially in nearly death, and it didn't stop at coffins. Some people requested post-mortem autopsies, just to be sure. Others demanded embalming, not to preserve, but to eliminate all doubt. Still others asked for a priest to visit the grave after 3 days and offer a final prayer or a knock. The poor, meanwhile, had superstition. They placed mirrors near the dead, left bread and water on the coffin, whispered goodbyes that included hopeful instructions like, "Don't come back." In the absence of equipment, ritual had to do. In one recorded case, a woman who feared being buried alive chose to sleep in her own coffin for the final year of her life, just to get used to it. It was cheaper than a safety bell, and arguably more honest. Governments predictably did little. There were no national programs for burial assurance, no standardized safety features. Occasionally a local law would pass, requiring a waiting period before burial, but most of these were ignored. Death, like most things, ran on a schedule and a budget, so the safety coffin remained a luxury item, a fear-based indulgence, like storm shutters in a town with no rain. You didn't need one, but it looked strange if you didn't have one, and if you were poor, you were simply buried, and everyone hoped you stayed that way. The fear didn't die, it just modernized. Tapophobia, the fear of being buried alive, still exists. It's rarer now, more niche, often bundled with broader anxieties about death, confinement or medical error. But it's there, lingering, especially in places where death is less bureaucratic and more ambiguous, places without modern hospitals or where funerals happen fast. Even in countries with advanced medicine, the occasional story slips through. Someone wakes up in a body bag. Someone scratches the inside of a coffin lid. Newspapers love these stories because they sound like horror fiction, but they aren't fiction. They're reminders that certainty is a luxury and mistakes still happen. Modern safety coffins still exist. Not widely, but they're sold. Some feature GPS systems, others have motion sensors. One model includes a microphone so you can call for help if you're not too panicked to speak. These are niche products, expensive and probably unnecessary, but they sell because the fear doesn't care about odds. It cares about stories, and there are plenty of those. Some people request open casket funerals, not for tradition, but for verification. Some leave written instructions, wait 24 hours, 48, 72, just to be sure. Others ask to be cremated immediately, so they don't have to think about it at all. Different tactics, same anxiety. Tapophobia today is subtle. It lives in jokes, in caution, in the nervous glance at the doctor's face when they say someone's gone. It's less theatrical than it used to be, less prone to bells and ladders, but no less human, because what people fear isn't death. Not really. It's being declared finished, while some small part of them is still waiting. The fear of being buried alive didn't vanish. It's simply rebranded. In the modern world, we no longer talk about coffin bells or spring-loaded lids. Now we talk about clinical death, misdiagnosis, and timing. Today, the terror lives in hospitals, in morgues, in protocols that can be rushed. It's no longer about being buried breathing. It's about being declared dead while there's still a flicker left. The headlines are scattered, but persistent. A man wakes up in a body bag. A woman regains consciousness just before an autopsy. A child, pronounced stillborn, exhales on the metal tray. These are not Gothic stories from the age of superstition. They're contemporary reports, documented, investigated, and awkwardly explained. Sometimes it's equipment error, sometimes human error, sometimes it's the body simply refusing to follow the script. Medicine is more precise now, but still imperfect. Death, it turns out, is not a switch. It's a process. Organs shut down at different rates. Electrical activity lingers, reflexes misfire. Breath pauses and returns. In certain cases, a body may present all the signs of death, yet still hold on to something undecided. And this brings us to the modern version of the safety coffin. Bureaucracy. Instead of a bell cord, we have paperwork. Instead of a flag, we have a checklist. Multiple doctors must confirm a death. Observations are repeated. In some places, a mandatory waiting period is enforced before cremation or organ donation. It's not foolproof, but it's meant to slow things down, to ensure. Yet the old fear remains just beneath the surface. It has a new name: premature declaration or clinical misdiagnosis, but it triggers the same primal dread to be helpless, to be unaware, or worse, to be aware but unheard. Nowhere is this more complicated than in the realm of organ donation. Once death is confirmed, timing is critical. Organs must be preserved. Procedures begin quickly. In some cases, very quickly. And while medical standards are in place, some people still hesitate, not because they object to donation, but because the gap between confirmed dead and dissection feels disturbingly short. This tension has created a new kind of cultural anxiety. We don't talk about it over dinner, but it lingers in legal forms, end-of-life planning, and quiet questions like, how do they know? The old stories of bells and tubes and glass panels may feel quaint now, but the sentiment behind them is familiar. We don't fear death as much as we fear being mistaken for it. In some countries, cases have led to changes in policy, more observation time, delayed burial, technology that monitors for subtle brain activity. It's all very official, very modern. But if you step back, it looks oddly familiar. Just another version of the same old plan. Wait, check, confirm. Because deep down, we still don't fully trust death to be obvious. And the safety coffin, whether made of wood and brass, or paperwork and time codes, remains quietly in place, not to save us, but to reassure us that if the line between life and death blurs, someone somewhere might still be listening. Eventually the fear quiets. The bells stop ringing, the levers rust, the watchmen leave, and the coffins, elaborate or not, return to what they were always meant to be: silent, heavy, unmoving. There are no more speaking tubes, no flags, no elaborate instructions etched in brass, just earth and time and the assumption that everything is finally still. It's strange, in a way, how much effort we once spent planning for the possibility of error, the schematics, the devices, the precautions, not to avoid death, but to avoid the wrong kind, the accidental kind, the kind that leaves claw marks on the inside of the lid. And now we have machines, scans, protocols, red tape. We've replaced panic with process. The bells are digital. The flags are forms. The speaking tube has been upgraded to consent documentation and bedside monitors that beep in rhythms we hope someone understands. But the fear that little edge of uncertainty still lingers in the margins, in the pause before a doctor speaks, in the echo of a flat line that might not be final, in the part of the form where you sign your name and wonder what happens after that. We tell ourselves it's fine, that we've advanced, that no one is buried alive anymore. Mostly. Probably. The dirt is quieter now, the coffins simpler, the goodbyes a little more sterile, but underneath it all, the human part remains, the part that isn't quite sure when the story ends. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the real function of the bell was never rescue, just reassurance. You don't need it to ring. You just need to know it's there.